Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. In part one of this series called Forcing Women Head Covering, Hijab, we discussed the current situation in Iran and Iranian clerics' methodology on hijab versus the Islamic methodology. We now continue in part two with the Quranic perspective on hijab and Islamic perspective on modest clothing in general and the reasoning behind it. Please note, there is enough clear and explicit mention of head covering in the Quran that there's no need to refer to any hadith, and there's unanimous agreement in its mandate among all sects and schools of thought within Islam. Before discussing the relevant Quranic verses, I should mention that head covering was a common practice among women in not only Arabia, but also other places where Christians and Jews lived. In fact, we see in the Bible, 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 through 10, it says, "In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest clothing and decency and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but that which is proper for women professing godliness with good works." And in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3 through 9, it says, "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her hair shaved, then she should cover her head. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man." These are verses in the Bible that command women to have modest clothing, plus the head covering. As a side note, some Westerners see Muslim women's hijab as a sign of Muslim man's authority over them, perhaps due to what they understood from these verses in 1 Corinthians 11, which compare man's and woman's origin and the command for women to cover their hair as a sign of male authority over them. Whereas in Islam, women wear hijab as a sign of modesty and that men and women are equal in spirit and as humans. At any case, we see that head covering was customary even before Islam, not just among people of the book, but the idolaters of Arabia. Hence, Islam did not invent it, rather enjoined a different way of wearing it. So it covers the neck and the upper chest or bosom. They used to wear the head covering and throw the sides of each end behind their ears and shoulders, which left their neck and upper chest exposed. Islam directed pulling it forward in order to cover the neck and chest. That's it. We now discuss the specific verses about women's head covering for those who are interested to know what the Book of Allah says specifically. But first, let's clarify the terminology used for the head covering in the Quran versus the terminology commonly used in the conversations. The Quran refers specifically to the head covering or headscarf as khumur, which is plural for khimar, and there is another term in the Quran which is for head covering called jalabib, which is plural for jilbab, which we'll explain later. The term hijab, commonly used for head covering in conversation, does not mean just a head covering. Hijab in the Quranic lexicon means a curtain, a separator, a partition, a barrier, or that which completely covers the body or anything else from being seen, from covering it from being seen, not a headscarf. Some English translation of the Quran erroneously call hijab a veil, which in English veil means headscarf, but in Quranic lexicon it means a curtain, a blanket, or a partition. Interestingly, some English dictionaries, when they use the term veil as a verb, they say it means to cover, to mask, or to shroud. So those who say the term hijab in the Quran is for Prophet's wives only, not for all women in general, they are right. But by saying so, they want to draw a wrong conclusion from a correct statement, either out of ignorance or to mislead others. We already said in the Quranic language, hijab refers to complete covering or blocking the sight, not just a head covering or headscarf. But it is a word that is commonly used to refer to a head covering in the conversation, not in the Quran. The verse they are referring to is verse 33:53, which says, "O you who have believed, do not enter the houses of the Prophet except when you are permitted for a meal without awaiting its readiness. But when you are invited, then enter." And then continues and says, "And when you ask his wives for something, ask them from behind a partition," hijab. Yes, this verse is exclusive to Prophet's wife regarding hijab, or partition, or curtain, as the Quran calls it, which is not required for other women. However, this does not mean head covering, what we call hijab, is not required for other women, because the following verses explicitly and clearly call for women covering their hair by a headscarf. We will review the relevant portions with both Arabic and English terminologies in order to explain them and address the misunderstandings as well. Allah commands in chapter 24, verses 30 and 31, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ ذَلِكَ أَزْكَىٰ لَهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ. Tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their private parts. That is purer for them. Indeed, Allah is aware of what they do. That was for men. Then in the next verse, 31, repeats it for women with a couple of additions. وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their private parts and not expose their adornment except that which necessarily appears thereof, and to draw a portion of their head covers, khumur, over their chest. Few points here. Number one, both verses start with believing men and believing women, mu'mineen and mu'minat. So the verse here is addressing the believers, those who have faith, believing in God and His book, and willingly submit and surrender to God and His commands. Not just anybody or the non-Muslim. Hence, in the context of head covering, it is addressing such believing women. Number two, then after saying guard their private parts, the verse says to believing women, وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. Do not expose their adornment, beauty, zina, except that which necessarily appears thereof. This is a very important part to note. Here, their adornment, zinatahunna, refers to her place of adornment, zina, on her body, like the chest, where she puts a necklace on, or any portion of her body that is part of her beauty. Obviously, by adornment, it does not mean the jewelry itself, like earring or necklace, which are openly displayed at the jewelry shop. It is rather the place of adornment on the body, which is also part of her beauty. One of the adornments is woman's hair, which is part of her beauty. She fixes it in many ways to adorn it and to beautify herself. As you know, today, woman's hair coloring and hair styling is a big industry, all of which to adorn or beautify women. How many times you hear such and such woman on TV has a beautiful hair or attractive hair, in fact, more so than other parts of her body. Woman's face is also part of her beauty, and she adorns it with makeup, etc. But that is the part that necessarily appears from her body, due to obvious reasons. So do her hands. Her face necessarily appears for the purpose of identification, obviously seeing, to be able to see, eating, etc. And of course, to avoid hardship. Muslim women expose their face even during an act of worship, such as prayer or Hajj. You might ask, what about burqa? Covering face is not a requirement in Islam, and it is rather cultural. So far, we see that she covers any part of her body which is part of her beauty and place of adornments, and that includes her head, with the exception of face, which is necessarily out. Later, the verse repeats, وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ, and not expose their adornment, except, and they will say that, except to their husbands, their fathers, their sons, their brothers, etc. This means they can expose a part of their beauty or adornment, including hair, to certain members of their family, as stipulated later in the verse. In other words, the verse says, do not expose their adornment, beauty, zina, twice in this verse. First time, it is referring to when she is out in the public, outside, which does include her hair and head covering. And the second time, it is when she's at home, where she can expose her hair in front of certain members of her family, as mentioned in the next part of the verse. Number 3. Now, with above explanation on the first part, the verse then continues, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, and to wrap or draw a portion of their head covers over their chest. 3 points here. 1, by head covers, the Quran means hair covering, not the entire head, which includes face. When the Quran wants to talk about face, it uses a specific word, wujuh, which means face only, faces only, not the head. You can see the example of this verse 5-6 discussing the wudu. Second point about the term وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ here, lam ya is added in the beginning of the verb ضَرَبَ to make it an imperative verb, which is a verb that expresses a command. Those in doubt can see similar application of lam ya in other verses in the Quran as commands, like verse 33 or 63, this very same chapter 24 and other places. Third point is that the term daraba in Arabic means bringing together or cuffing, striking, or drawing two things firmly together, like clapping hand, for example, among other things, other meanings. So the verb is commanding that they firmly bring together what? That is in the next term, which is بِخُمُرِهِنَّ. We already said khumur is the plural for khimar, which comes from a root word khamara, to literally mean hiding, concealing, or covering something. So then khimar means head covering or head scarf, according to Arabic dictionaries such as Al-Qamus al-Muhit, Al-Munjad, and Lisan al-Arab by Ibn Manzur. Khimar is what people call hijab today in conversation. The verse continues ala juyubihinna, over their chest. The term juyubihinna comes from the root word jayb, which means slit, cut out, or neckline of a dress, or top opening of a dress, which is bound to be reveal part of woman's bosom. Hence, juyubihinna means their upper bosom area, which includes the neck. We already discussed that women at pre-Islamic era had some sort of head covering. From idolaters to Jews to Christian, all did so in some form or fashion. However, they threw the two sides, the two ends of head covering or headscarves behind their ears, as you have seen with ancient Egyptians, or they threw it to back of their shoulder. As a result, not only their neck and upper chest were exposed, but also the head covering often would slide back, exposing part of their hair. Allah says in the verse, since their bosom area, hair, and neck are places of adornment and beauty, or part of their beauty, take the two ends of their headscarf, and instead of throwing it in the back, bring them from the behind the shoulder, pull them tight together in front, or wrap them firmly together in front in order to cover their upper chest, which will also, as a result, cover their neck and keep their head covering from sliding back and exposing their hair. This would result in covering their heads, hair, necks, and chest. In this way, they cover their beauties not to be displayed before wondering eyes, not even in a sudden encounter between man and woman. A God-fearing, believing man will always try not to make such a look last long or repeated. Yet, it may have a lasting effect if the charms and adornments are seen even shortly. The term daraba is especially used to indicate pulling or bringing together the two ends firmly or tightly, so these portions are not exposed during movement either. Now, some people have said the verse does not say a woman must cover her head or hair, rather her chest only. The response is they already covered their head and hair, and the verse already mentioned covering any place of adornment, which included their head, except for face. Plus, if the hair covering was not required, then the verse would not have even mentioned the word head covering, and would have just said specifically, she must cover her chest only. So that later, when some women do not wear a headscarf, know that they still need to cover their chest. But the Quran includes the headscarf, meaning it is required. But so happened, the women of that time wore it commonly, but differently. it is misleading or playing with words to say covering hair is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. We can also say there's no specific reference in the Quran about intoxicants and gambling to be explicitly haram, forbidden. They are referred as defilement from the work of Satan, so we are commanded to avoid them, not go near them, which not only implies it is forbidden, but also explicitly says stay away from them, which supersedes the term forbidden. Plus, in another verse, they are called great sin, ithmun kabir. Wouldn't a great sin and work of Satan, that must be avoided be considered as forbidden? Furthermore, in verse 31, we have the term and not expose their adornment, وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ, used twice in the verse. The first time it is about their headscarf covering their chest in order to conceal their hair, neck, and chest to all men in public. The second time it is used about covering her adornment, zina, to her husband and specific biological family members, those not allowed to marry, like brother, father, son. But this time the verse does not mention her head covering, meaning she does not have to cover her hair, or she does not have to have hijab, as we say, in front of these members. Of course, there are other places of adornment that still need to be covered, even with family members, which is generally from chest down. At the end of the verse, it says, and let them not stamp their feet to make known that they conceal what they conceal of their adornments, meaning they must not draw attention to themselves even by stomping their feet on the ground, so the ankle bracelets they used to wear make noise. Of course, today they don't wear ankle bracelets that make noise, but wear other things that can draw attention. Notice the verse did not even say, do not wear ankle bracelets or whatever they wear today. But actually, the whole point of this verse is drawing attention. And if Allah is saying, do not make sound with your feet to draw attention, meaning going out of your way to draw attention with a sound of your adornment, then you can imagine what he means earlier in the verse about drawing attention by actual visual display of woman's beauty. The next verse in the Quran, which discusses head covering, would be 33:59. Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu qul li azwajika wa banatika wa nisa'il mu'minin yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna dhalika adna an yu'rafna fala yu'dhina wa kana Allahu ghafuran rahima. O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers to bring down over themselves part of their outer garments, long headscarves, that is more suitable, so that they will be known as believing women and not be bothered, harassed. And Allah is forgiving and merciful. The verse addresses Prophet's wives, daughters, and again, believing women through instruction to Prophet himself to bring down or keep close their veils or outer garment so that they are recognized as believing women and for their own protection. Yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna. Notice the word dena. Dena means to come close. And the word yudnin means pulling close, draw near, or draw over. So yudnina alayhinna means to draw down over themselves, pull close or over themselves. And next, the word jalabib comes from the root word jalaba, which means to pull something from another. Jalabib, then according to dictionaries, is the plural form of jilbab, meaning an outer garment or coverall for women covering the whole body. It also means, according to dictionaries, a veil or a long headscarf covering head down to waist. And some said just another name for headscarf. Hence, in this verse, we have a longer version of head covering or veil that women must draw down close to themselves when in public, or wear over what they already wear in the house. And it is this covering from head down that Allah deems suitable for the believing virtuous women and their protection. O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers to bring down over themselves part of their outer garment, long veils or headscarves, that is more suitable, so they will be known as believing women and not be bothered or harassed. Allah is ever forgiving, merciful. These two verses capture the essence of woman's head covering and modest appearance, what we commonly call hijab, but what the Quran specifically calls khumur and jalabib as part of the overall hijab. Therefore, no question about this mandate in the Quran, with agreement of all Islamic sects and schools of thought, that as a minimum, a woman must wear a head covering or headscarf that keeps her hair from exposure and covers her neck and chest, and loose opaque clothes covering the rest of her body. However, the ideal attire would be, that was as minimum, but the ideal attire would be an overall that covers her whole body on top of what she normally wears at home in conjunction with her long headscarf, as one can see many Muslim women wear throughout the world. As a side note, some scholars opined that Allah in this verse could have just said to his prophet to tell believing women, and that would have covered and included his wives and daughters. But he specifically says your wives and daughters, then believing women, which means the prophet himself as a husband and a father is responsible for his family's modest clothing. The implication is that husbands and fathers are somewhat responsible for educating and advising their wives and daughters to virtuous and modest covering or hijab. Notice it did not say force them to wear hijab or beat them so they obey. Interestingly, at the end of the verse, it says Allah is ever forgiving, merciful, meaning Allah speaks leniently with those who made mistakes in the past or perhaps have lapsed in this regard. It begs the question, if Allah can forgive, why some husbands or fathers can't do the same, and they end up resorting to bitterness, force, and violence? What about hijab's benefits and goals? As indicated earlier, head covering, hijab, in Islam by no means suggests that women are inferior to men. Islam promotes modesty and decency for both men and women, aiming to minimize immorality within the society. Hijab, or overall modest clothing, among other teachings, help to attain this goal. At the same time, while Islam discourages public display of immodest dress and sexual behavior, it encourages love, affection, and intimacy between married couples in private. What does verse 3359 mean by protection from harassment? Wisdom, hikmah, behind hijab is to minimize the sexual enticement and moral decay in the society. Hijab helps protect women and men and the society by creating stability both in families and communities in many ways, such as the following. Number one, protect women from unwanted advances and perverted looks. Number two, protect women from shallow men who are attracted only to women's physical body. Number three, potentially help reduce the risk of sexual assaults against women. These 3 points can be summarized as Dr. Nayak would put it in a question form. If you have a pair of identical twin sisters walk down the street, one with full hijab and the other with miniskirt and her upper body semi-exposed and made-up hair, which one do you think is going to attract the guy's attention and wondering eyes down the street? Number four, help reduce sexual exploitation of women based on appearance. And we are all familiar with this one as well because we live in a society that exploits women's sexuality by men for men. From sexually suggestive billboard ads, like a woman in bikini next to a car battery advertisement, to TV ads, magazine ads, to regular movies, down to soft and hardcore pornographic material, all exploiting woman's body. Number five, protect against temptation and harmful desires. Number six, help woman keep her dignity and respect for what she really is as a person and a human being rather than her physical attributes only. Islam teaches a woman must be respected for her virtuous character and actions than her looks or physical features, of which she had little or no control over. She does not have to use her body and charm to gain recognition or acceptance in society, as her hijab directs self-worth away from appearance toward qualities such as piety, good character, modesty, and intellect, and that she shares her physical beauty with her husband only. Please note, the purpose of these verses is not to confine women to their houses, but to make it safe and dignified for them to go about their daily business without attracting unwholesome attention. Nor by any means these verses mean men and women are unequal because of unequal modest dress code. This is an absurd assertion made by those who seem to think men and women are physically equal, so must dress equally. The fact of the matter is that men and women were built differently, beside the physical attributes, which is obvious. Man tends to be far more attracted to woman's physical body than woman to man's. That is a fact. How many sexual harassment or sexual assaults do you hear about occurring on the streets or even in the workplace by women toward men? Next to none. Islam recognizes this, and that is why the relevant verses start by men lowering their gaze, covering their private parts, and continue with the same for women, with the addition of other parts of her body that could attract unpleasant and unwanted attention. That said, Islam gives equal rights to both as humans and considers both from the same soul. Wearing headscarf by no means imply inferiority or inequality. These are some of the benefits of hijab. But when talking about these benefits, one must also discuss what happens to a society that disregards or completely lacks modest clothing and hijab. Well, we should be familiar with the answer to this question, especially those of us living in the West, where women's sexually explicit images are everywhere. Explicit ads with semi-naked bodies of women in order to lure men to buy. Ads on things that have nothing to do with a woman's body. It does not stop there. The sexually explicit images have found their way in just about every movie, even in scenes and plots completely unrelated to a woman's body. It seems as if there is no sexually explicit scenes in a movie, there's no buyers for it. Of course, then there is the softcore and hardcore pornographic material for those whom just an image of a semi-naked or naked woman is no longer enticing and exciting anymore. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry created and catered by men for men, exploiting woman's body and using it like a commodity, which is readily available at the tip of your finger through internet. The result is sexual addiction, sexual promiscuity, destruction of husband and wife intimate relation in marriages, because 99% of wives cannot compete with the variety and perfect images of models in these movies and ads. Hence, infidelities and inability to have normal, intimate relation with wives. Plus, prevalence of sexual assaults, rapes, and prison full of sexually related crimes. There's more, but this is a topic on its own, hence deserves a separate lecture. Looking at this from community level, Islam acknowledges that attraction to the other sex is both natural and profound because God has made it the means by which human life continues. It is a permanent attraction that subsides for a while and then regains its strength. To stare it at all times will undoubtedly keep it on the boil, hence requiring physical satisfaction. Islam wants to establish a clean society where desire is not aroused at every moment and erotic scenes are not displayed everywhere. Continual excitement of the sexual urge leads to an insatiable desire that may become unstoppable. Something as trivial as a secret look, a seductive move, a smile, or even the tone in one's speech, all the way to glaring makeup and thinly or tightly dressed bodies, are meant only to add to such insatiable and uncontrolled excitement, where one's caution and discretion and self-control are heavily taxed, burdened. Hence, we are left with two options: either total permissiveness that disregards all checks and values, or deal with psychological problems and disorders and that result from having to suppress a desire that has been strongly aroused, plus the criminal implication. These borders to outer torture. One way Islam uses for achieving the goal of establishing a clean human society is to prevent such uncontrollable excitement of the sexual urge. It wants the natural sexual urge of both men and women to remain healthy, maintaining its natural strength, and to satisfy it in the proper, clean manner. This is what Islam prefers. The two verses we just discussed give us some examples of steps Islam takes to reduce the chances of unnatural excitement and sin. At the end, hijab is a directive by God mentioned in the Quran, the book of God. It is not a command or a suggestion from a person. If one believes in God and His book, then observes what's in it. Granted, hijab is not easy for some women, especially in societies where Muslims are minority. It is an obligation that requires a level of dedication beyond that which one might have for performing the acts of worship. Of course, at the same time, it's not as important as praying, fasting, and performing other acts of worship. But I would say that it is through these acts of worship, supplications, and one's Quranic education that one reaches to that level of dedication. Back to the protests, we discussed the behavior of Iranian clerics in charge who have a hijab by force policy and the new waves of protests in Iran. What about the people who are protesting? Some taking off their hijab as a sign of civil disobedience, and some protesting with their hijab against the policy of hijab by force and their right to choose, and against much more important issues like economy, jobs, inflation, and corruption. All of which is fine, but there is a sliver of hypocrisy both inside and outside Iran, especially with those who are protesting against hijab enforcement policy and asking for freedom to wear or not. Freedom to wear or not. Similarly, people throughout the world sympathizing with plight of Iranian women on public and social media, all of which are good. But the question is, where were they when other countries like France started suppressing hijab, forcing women not to wear them in certain places? And same thing recently in India. Why didn't they come out and protest about freedom of choice then? Why were they and continue to be quiet in the case of other way around? In conclusion, hijab or head covering is a reality and a command from God, which many Muslim women observe, but forcing it is not. Hikmah, wisdom, is an Islamic concept which unfortunately has been absent and not been applied in many issues within Muslim Ummah, especially in places like Iran and Afghanistan. Hence, an explosion of reactions and protests from citizens within their borders as well as those outside their borders, especially in the social media. Another important point that Muslim communities are lacking, especially in these countries, is the comprehensive understanding of Islam. Islam as a whole, not in bits and pieces. We literally have Muslim women who all they know about Islam is hijab, plus perhaps praying and fasting. That's it. Nothing wrong with inviting to hijab, but we must realize there are many other things in Islam which we need to introduce and talk about even before the hijab discussion. For example, when we have not provided means for women to gain education in some parts of the world and have not given them any good reason for it either, how do we expect the outcome will be? While it is a reality that educated professional Muslim women are needed in any community to carry out specific and critical tasks such as teaching to women, providing medical and health care to women, and in many other roles, knowledge that is needed for deen and dunya. When these steps are not taken, and many rights of people, men and women, have been taken away, people's condition have been ignored, and of course, not much of Islam has been introduced and explained, then we get fixated on someone's hijab or beard or other trivial things. Surely we are causing people to develop complexes and turn away. When a government adopts a law, it must also accept its responsibility as the legislator. When inviting to an aspect of Islam, the totality of Islam must also be introduced and invited to, because all aspects are connected and must be considered and understood. The point here and the message here to Muslim government leaders are as follows. Number one, ask yourself, do you consider yourself a leadership chosen by people, for the people, who fears God and holds all its members accountable before God? That is, a true Muslim government who is qualified to be called so. Two, if you claim you are doing Amr bil Ma'ruf, enjoining that which is good, know that it works both ways, not just state officials to people. It also works in other direction, people to state officials. When you make a mistake, you and your officials must be called to account by the people. However, with hikmah, kindness, education, and proper communication in both directions, not by force, harassment, and violence. Number three, leave the main job of Amr bil Ma'ruf and invitation and education to experts and expert organizations. People who do Amr bil Ma'ruf and invite to Islam and give Islamic education should be from the ranks of people, not on the government payroll. Number four, be comprehensive when you discuss Islam. Give the full Islamic picture and theme before discussing any subsidiary concepts or issues. Confirm that which is true and reject that which is false or made up by people or misunderstood, or that which has nothing to do with Islam. People must look at Islam as a whole. Reminds me of the famous story you might have heard of. There was a village whose residents were all blind. They had heard about an animal called elephant, but had never known anything about it. So when an elephant came passing through and they heard it, they went to it and started touching it, feeling it, so they can understand what it is like as each of them started touching different parts of it. One touched the leg, the other the tail, another one the ear, and so on. Later, when a man who was not blind came by and asked them what the elephant was like, one of them who had touched its ear said, "It's like a big thin bread." The other one who touched the leg said it was like a pillar. Yet another one who touched the tail said it was like a big broom. And the one who touched the trunk, of course, said it was like a pipe. The man said, "None of what you described is an elephant. then went on to describe it as a whole, which was an animal with 4 legs and 2 large ears, a trunk, and a tail, and so forth. Same thing with Islam, which has been blindly or partially understood, of which some people have only known the hijab, some the long beard, some know the Quran's recitation, some the prayer, some the 4 wives, some jihad, and so forth. Each have touched 1 or 2 aspects of Islam, a deficient view of Islam. It signifies lack of understanding of Islam as a whole, as a comprehensive way of life which is, if understood as a whole and implemented properly, will bring happiness, peace, and success in this life and the next. All in all, what I want to say is the following. Number 1, history has shown time and again, when you force something on people, especially in the matter of faith, it only produces hypocrites, aversion, and will surely backfire at some point. Number 2, when Islam is introduced properly as a whole, not impartial, when people are educated and invited to its principles, patiently, with love, kindness, encouragement, and without any force, I submit there might be no need even to make civil laws on certain moral and personal issues like modest dress code. People will decide on their own favorably once they learn the harms versus benefits. Do mullahs in charge know all this? As uneducated as some of them are about Islam, some do know about all this. However, as their un-Islamic policies and behavior have demonstrated, they do not want to adhere to any of these because it is not in their best political interest, which means they have already sold their soul and akhirah hereafter to power, control, and politics of dunya, this life. Hence, one can conclude they have squandered and blown away a golden opportunity to make Iran a prime example or a model nation among Muslim nations in the world. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.